Chapter 1691. Edison looked at Knollys in surprise. Isn't this red-haired woman Maggie? The C-class model who had a scandal with Ken last year. He remembered that Ken, who was still engaged to Lara last year, was busted by the media for secretly meeting with Maggie at a horse farm in a foreign country, and Jonah had been furious about it. After that, Ken stepped forward to explain the whole thing, and everyone put the incident at the back of their minds. Knollys put the magazine down and asked, "He is going to offer you to Mr. Matthews?" Maggie nodded hurriedly. "He's going to turn me into someone who resembles Lara. But I know I'll die once I go to Donald's side." Knollys squinted and thought for a few moments. After that, he rose to his feet and asked, "When is he going to do it?" Maggie bit her lips and said, "He has found me a doctor. In about 3 months. You just follow what he wants you to do." "What?" Maggie was stunned. Knollys then continued indifferently. "I can assure your safety when you fall into Donald's hands. But the problem is that, do you trust me?" Maggie fell into contemplation. She knew what Ken was going to do with her. If not, she wouldn't have come to the Knolls and asked for their help. On top of that, if it weren't for Knollys, she would have been killed by Lara's men back then. As if she had made up her mind, she said, "Okay. I trust you." The secretary sent her out. Edison walked up to Knollys and asked, "Sir, is she the mole you inserted beside Ken?" Standing in front of the window, Knollys said, "It all began with a coincidence. When her relationship with Ken was exposed last year, Lara found someone to get rid of her. I thought that she would come in handy in the future, so I saved her. Of course, she was rather a useful woman. After all, judging from the fact that she could make Ken fall for her back, it proved that she had some tricks up her sleeves as well. And now, she would become the pawn in helping him turn the tide to his favor when the time had ripened." Meanwhile, at the college, Daisy had been rehearsing the whole morning. After the rehearsal was over, her back was drenched with sweat. She came down from the stage, pulled out a tissue, and began to wipe the corner of her forehead. The weather was hot, so she had just put on a close-fitting sports undershirt that accentuated her perfect body figure. Everyone was sitting on the floor after the rehearsal was over. Even though they had switched on the air conditioner, it was useless on a summer day like this one. Daisy looked toward Ian. It had been a few days since he talked to her, and it seemed to her that he had finally realized something. Even though she felt it was a shame, she felt this was the best for both of them. One of their students distributed some cold drinks to them. Daisy took a bottle of cold Coke and said, "Thank you." She unscrewed the cap, tilted her head, and drank it. Ian was talking to other people in front of the stage. Meanwhile, he also kept looking at Daisy, who was guzzling down a bottle of Coke through the corner of his eyes. Daisy draped a thin jacket over her shoulders. She sat in the audience studying the script of the play when a dark shadow blocked the light in front of her eyes. She lifted her head and saw Ian. He asked, "Can we talk?" Daisy closed the script and straightened her back. "What is the thing that you want to talk about?" Ian looked around and said, "There are a lot of people here. Let's go to the corridor." Smiling, she replied, "I don't think that's necessary. If you have anything to say, you can say it here." She kept her guard up and refused to leave her seat. Ever since she learned that he was with Ken, she did not trust him anymore. Ian lowered his head and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lie to you." Daisy was stunned but retained the smile on her face. "You don't have to apologize. I already know." Before she could finish her sentence, her vision turned blurry, and she rubbed her eyes. Ian looked at her. "What's wrong?" Daisy rose to her feet, and the script fell to the floor. She bent over to take it but nearly lost her balance and fell. Chapter 1692. Ian went forward and supported her. "Daisy." Daisy tried to push him away, but to no avail. Ian hurriedly wrapped his arm around her shoulder and said, "You look tired. Let me bring you to get some rest." A few students noticed their situation and went forward to ask. Ian smiled and replied, "She isn't feeling well, so I'm sending her to the infirmary." The group of students did not say anything afterward. Suddenly, Daisy pushed him away with all her strength, but her knees accidentally knocked the corner of the chair. She hissed, and the pain woke her up slightly. Seizing her chance while she was in possession of herself, she ran out without even taking the script. Ian picked up the script and said, "I'll go look after her." The group of students looked at each other in confusion. Daisy was moving forward slowly with her hands on the wall. The world in her vision was spinning rapidly. She smacked herself on her head several times, and her blood flowed rapidly. Even her pulse and heart rate accelerated. After walking for a few more steps, she couldn't hold on anymore. When she was about to fall to the floor, Ian appeared and scooped her into his arms. Meanwhile, Freya entered the auditorium with food and water. She looked across the hall. All of the students were there, but she couldn't see Daisy around. She stopped a female student and asked, "Have you seen Daisy?" The female student was stunned for a moment and replied, "She wasn't feeling well, so Ian sent her to the infirmary." A bad feeling rose from Freya's stomach pit when she heard what the female student said. She turned around and headed straight toward the infirmary. However, neither Daisy nor Ian was there in the infirmary. She suddenly realized something, and her face turned pale. She tried to get through to Daisy, but did not answer her call. At the corner of the business school's administration building, Freya ran into Colton, who was talking with another two students. Without caring for the two students, she rushed toward him and shouted, "Colton!" Colton turned his head around, but Freya dragged him away before he could say anything. The people around them were stunned, and Colton flung her hand away. "What are you doing?" Huffing and puffing heavily, she said, "Daisy." She just mentioned her name, and Colton was able to realize something had happened from the expression on her face. He grabbed her shoulder tightly and asked, "What happened to her?" Ian took her away. Meanwhile, Ian brought Daisy to the utility room. After confirming that no one was in the corridor, he locked the door. He placed Daisy on the block mats, and she frowned in discomfort at the sudden movement. Ian went closer to her and whispered, "Daisy?" Daisy's eyelids fluttered heavily as she opened her eyes weakly. Her vision was blurred, and everything she saw was Ian's face. Her pupils constricted slightly, and she tried to push him away. "Get away from me." Ian grabbed her shoulders and said with a hoarse voice, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to do this either, but I don't have a choice." Daisy felt a surge of coldness rushing down her body, but in the next second, she felt hot. Her body was shaking profusely, and beads of sweat were oozing out of the corner of her forehead. She tried to grab his collar and said, "Ian, don't do this. You're going to destroy yourself." Ian lowered his head and undid the buttons. Something flitted across his eyes as he said, "I lied to you. I'm not from the southwest region of Eurasia. Instead, I'm from a remote suburban town. My father was a stowaway, and my mother left my father and me when I was a kid. Ian Harris isn't my name either. It was given to me by Miss Reese. Without Miss Reese's help, I wouldn't have gotten into the art school and wouldn't be here today. I have no other choice but to help Mr. Pruitt." He lowered his head and kissed Daisy's wrist. "Daisy, I'll make you fall for me." Due to the effect of the drug, Daisy felt weak. She tried to fight back, but to no avail. She couldn't do anything but allow herself to be handled by Ian like a porcelain doll, and the light in her eyes was fading away. Ian slowly stretched his hand up to undress her upon seeing her condition. His desire eventually overrode the guilt inside of him as he couldn't wait to get her. Chapter 1693. Suddenly, the door was pushed open from the outside, stunning him. He turned his head around, and a fist landed on his face before he could do anything. He fell to the floor. Colton pounced on him and grabbed him by his collar without giving him a chance to take a breath. As he showered Ian with punches, he roared, "How dare you? How dare you do this to her?" When Freya entered, the first thing she saw was Colton punching Ian on top of him. She turned her head around and looked at Daisy. She realized that Daisy had been drugged, so she hurriedly got her up from the floor. She patted her cheek and called out her name, Daisy? Stop fighting. Come look at Daisy first, she shouted. Colton's fist stopped midair. He pushed Ian away and kicked him for one last time. He pointed at him and said, if anything happens to her, not only you, tell Ken to wash his neck and wait for me. Ian did not say anything in return. His nose was bleeding, and half of his face was bruised. The most apparent bruises were at the corner of his eyes and mouth. Colton grabbed Daisy up from the floor and took her away. Freya stopped in front of the door and turned around to look at Ian. Wake up. Ken will only abandon you in the end. Just like how he abandoned the Reeses. Ian did not say anything in return. Colton sent Daisy to the infirmary. The doctor drew her blood for a test, and when he came out with the report, he asked in a serious voice, did she take any controlled substances? Colton was stunned. His face sank as he asked, what kind of substance is it? The doctor replied, it's a kind of roofie. People will become weak and unconscious after injecting or taking this drug. It contains sedative effects and can be very harmful to the body when taken in large quantities. Colton clenched his fists tightly, and his face turned cold. It was never in his wildest dream that Ian would use a roofie on his sister. If he hadn't checked the surveillance in time and knew where Ian had taken her, his sister's future would have been ruined by now. It was already evening by the time Daisy woke up. Something flitted across her head, and she sprang up. Knowles pulled open the curtain upon hearing her movement and walked in. Daisy. Daisy looked at him in a trance and said, Nolly. Noll's heart tightened when he saw the expression on her face. He sat at the side of the bed and stroked her pale cheek. You're safe now. Don't be afraid. I'm here now. Daisy did not say anything, and her body continued to tremble. Knowles grabbed her into his arms, and it was only when she felt his warmth that Daisy relaxed. She buried her head into his chest and cried. Knowles kissed the top of her head and comforted her patiently. However, she didn't see that his expression was dark. He had nearly gotten out of control when he got the news from Freya. Daisy was like a lock that kept the monster inside of him in check. If someone tried to open the lock, bad things would happen. At present, he couldn't wait to shred into pieces Ian, who attempted to violate Daisy. She cried so much that it broke his heart. Nolly, am I not clean anymore? Knowles tightened his arms around her and chuckled. Who said that? You're the cleanest. But. Silly girl, do you think that guy would get his way when Colton and I are with you? Knowles wiped the tears off the corner of her eyes and planted a kiss on her forehead. Daisy, you're awake. Freya came inside. Daisy wiped the tears off and pushed Knowles away. She raised her head to look at Freya. Freya? What are you doing here? Knowles rose to his feet and stopped beside Freya. His face was dark as he said, you keep her accompanied. I need to settle something. After Knowles left, Freya sat beside the side of the bed and asked, how do you feel now? Chapter 1694. Daisy lowered her head and replied, I'm feeling a lot better. Thank goodness that your brother arrived just in time. Do you still remember how you got roofied? Asked Freya. Daisy was stunned. I was roofied. She did not know what had happened to her at all. She had not eaten anything at all. All she had ever taken was just a bottle of Coke. Daisy suddenly froze. Coke. Is it that bottle of Coke? Freya looked at her and asked, can you remember anything? I just took a bottle of Coke, but Ian wasn't the one who gave it to me. Every classmate had a bottle of Coke. She had always kept her guard up whenever Ian was around her. She had not drunk from the bottle of water he had given her the last time. However, another classmate gave her that bottle of Coke, and almost all of the students in the auditorium had one. That was why she drank it without thinking twice. After listening to Daisy's narration, Freya knew Ian must have put something into the Coke bottle. Oh yeah, Ian. Daisy wanted to ask something, but paused midway through her sentence. It was without a doubt that she was disappointed. Ian had said he did not want to do something like that to her, and that he was forced. However, since he had chosen to do it, it meant he had made the decision himself and was not forced at all. Freya took a deep breath and said indifferently, "That isn't your business. If it hadn't been for your brother, he would have ruined your future. Starting from the moment he took the order from Ken to approach you, he had already sealed his own fate, in an abandoned factory." Several men in black punched and kicked the man whose head was covered. The man curled up on the ground and endured the pain that assaulted his body. The group of men in black stopped only after Knollace and Edison walked inside. They grabbed the man up and removed the cover from his head. The man squinted in discomfort to adjust to the sudden brightness until he could gradually make out the figures around him. Knollace took over the chair from Edison's hand and sat in front of Ian. Ian hadn't had the chance to recover from his previous injuries, and there were new bruises on his face right now. His body was screaming in pain as well. "It seems like Ken has a lot of expectations from you. It truly astounds me that you think you can get your hands on my woman with that appearance of yours." Lying on the ground, Ian coughed and panted heavily. "I would have succeeded if nothing went wrong." "It seems to me that you haven't learned your lesson yet," said Knollace. He picked up a bat from a man behind him and smashed it down on Ian's legs. The bat nearly snapped into two pieces from the collision, and Ian growled out in pain. His veins were appearing on his neck. His entire body was shaking profusely, and he couldn't feel his legs anymore. "Miss Reese gave you a new identity and got you into the art school. She even brought you into the modeling world. Without her, you wouldn't be here today." Knollace crossed his legs together and said calmly, "You work for her to pay her back. You don't want to disappoint her, but unfortunately, you take orders from Ken behind her back. Does Miss Reese know that this is how you're going to repay her?" Ian's pale face turned bloodless. Knollace spread his legs and leaned forward slightly. He looked straight into the man on the ground and continued. "It seems to me that you don't feel guilty at all for serving the man who imprisoned your supporter and killed her father." Ian remained silent. Knollace had run out of patience as he said, "Well, you're more loyal than I thought you are. In this case, I don't have to go easy on you anymore." He gave the man beside him an order, "Remove all his nails." The man walked to the side and picked up a plier. Two men came behind him to pin Ian on the ground, while one more stuffed a rag into his mouth to prevent him from biting his tongue. It was said that 10 fingers were connected to the heart. The pain of having one nail pulled out was something worse than death. Chapter 1695. The man applied some force and pulled the nail out with some flesh. Blood splattered on the man's face, leaving only a bloodied finger behind. Ian shouted hysterically. His eyes were filled with blood, his veins were bulging on the corner of his forehead, and there was a layer of sweat on his head. After removing the 5th nail, Ian passed out from the pain. The man looked at Knollace and said, "He's fallen unconscious." Knollace played with his watch and said indifferently, "Wake him up with water and continue." He rose to his feet with no expression on his face. "Pack these nails up and deliver them to Ken. Tell him that it's a big gift from me." After that, he turned around and left. When Ken received the bloodied package, his face sank. The secretary raised her head carefully and said, "Mr. Pruitt, he said these are Ian's nails. It seems like young Mr. Knowles has gotten Ian. I'm afraid he is in imminent danger." Ken took a deep breath and said, "It seems like he hasn't sold me out yet. But we've to get rid of him before he has the chance to do that." The secretary was stunned. "Are you going to kill him?" Ken lifted his eyelid and replied, "Exactly. But it's best if he died in Knollace's place." Even if Knollace knew he was the one behind Ian, Knollace wouldn't have any evidence as long as Ian was dead. Besides, Knollace was just going to torture Ian instead of killing him. However, once he died in Knollace's place, the entire Knowles would be in big trouble. At the Hilton Villas. Daisy was playing the piano in the piano room. Even though she took 2 days off from college, she had been keeping herself busy. Freya did not have any class, so she came to visit her. She leaned against the door and knocked on the door. Daisy was stunned and turned her head around. When she saw Freya, a smile appeared on her face. "Freya, you've come. I thought you could use some company, so I brought some food for you." Freya approached the piano and put the pancakes on top of it. The pancakes had become Daisy's favorite after eating them the last time. She opened up the packaging, and the room was instantly filled with the pancakes' fragrance. Suddenly, she remembered something and asked, "Other students don't know what happened to me, right?" Freya chuckled and said, "Don't worry. They all thought you were not feeling well, so you took a leave of absence. Besides, Ian has been suspended by the college for carrying controlled substances." Colton wouldn't let anyone know about what happened to Daisy to protect her reputation. The students in the college only knew that Ian was caught carrying controlled substances. They did not know about what Ian had attempted to do to Daisy. When Daisy fell silent, Freya leaned against the piano and said, "It's such a shame, right? Ian had a promising future. He was popular amongst the students in the art school. The teachers had a lot of expectations for him as well. If this hadn't happened, not only would he have been able to graduate from college successfully, but he could have also landed a good job. Unfortunately, he destroyed his own future with his own hands." Daisy lowered her head. She still remembered that she was stunned by Ian's appearance when she first saw him. However, Colton was right. Most of the people who approached her had their own motives due to her identity. Most of the time, even the most genuine hearts would be tainted by external factors and interests. Freya only left in the afternoon, and she bumped into Colton in the courtyard. She knew that Colton did not like her, so she just nodded at him and left. "Wait," said Colton. Freya was a little bit surprised and turned her head around. "You called me?" Colton's expression was stiff, and he seemed to have difficulty saying what he wanted to say next. "Thank you, for everything you've done for Daisy." Freya was stunned. "You're thanking me?" Chapter 1696. Colton's expression looked as restrained as always. "Is there anyone else here besides you?" Freya chuckled. "You're being so polite. If something were to happen to Daisy, I wouldn't be able to explain it to Nolace." As soon as she said that, she took a closer look at Colton. "You don't seem to be doing a good job as an elder brother." Colton's face looked sullen. Before he could say anything, Freya had already left without looking back. Daisy walked downstairs and saw Colton standing at the entryway, changing out of his shoes, so she walked over. "Colton." Colton asked, "Where's the housekeeper?" She explained with a smile, "The housekeeper's son is sick today, and I asked her to take the day off to take care of him." "Have you eaten lunch?" Seeing that he had rolled up his sleeves and walked to the kitchen, Daisy caught up to him. "Are you going to cook?" Colton washed his hands. "Otherwise, would you do it?" In the past, when Waylon was around, it was he who cooked for the three of them, and Waylon's cooking skills were as good as their father's. Although Colton's cooking was never as delicious as Waylon's, he was at least much better than her when it came to cooking. Daisy pulled out a chair, sat down at the dining table, and waited. Soon, Colton prepared his most skilled egg-fried rice and brought it to the table. From how the rice looked, it was not very pleasing to the eyes, but the taste was satisfactory to her. She picked up the spoon, took a big mouthful, and let off a hum. "Colton, the egg-fried rice is the only meal that you can put on the table." Colton fetched her another bowl of beef stew. "Cut the crap and just eat." She bit the spoon and grinned. Colton sat across from her and watched her eat. After a while, he cleared his throat. "That girl is barely worthy of being your friend." "That girl?" Daisy lifted her gaze and wondered. After a while, she realized who he was referring to. "Do you mean Freya?" Colton leaned back in the chair and looked away. "Who else are you with besides her?" Daisy sneered suddenly. Didn't you tell me to stay away from Freya before? He did not respond. Before this, I suspected that she had an ulterior motive. Apart from that, she's also Ken's sister, that's why I've been so rude to her. But when Ian took Daisy away, Freya's expression as she was rushing around to locate Daisy wasn't something one could imitate. I can still tell the difference whether it's true or not. Seeing that Daisy was staring at him, Colton turned his face away and snorted. Although I won't stop you from being friends with her, don't get too close to her. People change. Daisy lowered her gaze, but Freya knew that Ken wanted to use me and told me to be more careful of Ken. Actually, she could have helped Ken to deal with me so that she wouldn't have to be threatened. But Freya didn't do that. Ken would rather threaten her. Colton looked at her. How did she get threatened? Her family is so cold and ruthless, whether it's Ken or her mother. Freya is only about the same age as me, but her family actually threatened her to marry her to someone else. Marrying her to gain benefits, isn't it an act of selling their daughter? And if the other party is a middle-aged man who's old enough to be her father, won't that ruin Freya's life completely? She bit her lip. Colton, I want to help Freya. Colton frowned. Does she need you to intervene in her affairs? But she defied Ken and got threatened because of me. How can you say that this has nothing to do with me? For the first time, Colton was rendered speechless. Daisy stretched out her hand and tugged the hem of his sleeve. Colton, I know you're the best. You'll help me with this, won't you? Maggie had just undergone plastic surgery, and while she was still in hospital, Ken came to visit her. He sat beside the bed and greeted her with a caring tone. How do you feel? Does it still hurt? Chapter 1697. Maggie was lying on the bed, her whole face was wrapped in gauze, and she pretended to be exasperated. It hurts as fuck. Everything is still swollen. It'll recover in a few months. Ken held the back of her hand. Don't worry, Mr. Matthews won't get tired of your face so quickly. Maggie's eyes shifted from side to side. But what if he gets tired of me? Ken had a smile on his face, but there was not even a hint of merriment in his eyes. If he gets bored of you, I'll get someone to pick you up and out of his place. Really? Yeah, you should rest first. Ken got up and walked to the door. At that moment, one of his men stopped beside him. Sir. When his man approached his ear and whispered something into it, Ken's face dimmed instantly, and he immediately ignored the person lying in the ward and left with them. After waiting for them to leave, Maggie took out her cell phone, sent Knowles a text, and deleted the text right after it was sent. On the other side of the city, Knowles received Maggie's text message. He took a glance at it and put the phone back in his pocket. Edison came out of the ward. Mr. Knowles, the doctor said Ian's life has been saved, but I'm afraid he'll have to get amputated. Knowles squinted slightly. Ken, that fella is really ruthless. Edison guessed Ken's intention too. Yes, if you hadn't been more vigilant, I'm afraid that he would have died long ago. Ian is with us. If he were to die while he's here, it'd be very unfavorable to you. Once Knowles was charged with murder, the Knowles would probably be dragged into the public opinion's turmoil. Knowles scoffed. However, he didn't know that I did it on purpose. Pulling out Ian's nails and sending them to Ken was to let Ken know that Ian was our captive. And in order to keep his mouth shut, he would definitely make a move on Ian. Ken was not in a hurry because he bet that Ian wouldn't betray him and confess so quickly. As such, he chose to take action when I wasn't paying attention. Unfortunately, he's way too bumptious. A great general wants the people around him to bow down to him, be loyal, and not turn to ruthless means whenever things go wrong. However, Ken uses the people around him to the extreme. He's extremely conceited and arrogant and kicks anyone away from him the second they run out of value. How can such a general ever get loyal soldiers? But it's thanks to Ken's conceit that Maggie has sided with me. Interestingly, Maggie and his trusted subordinate Ian had gotten together secretly long ago. It's a piece of cake for her whenever she wants to know more about Ken's schedule and affairs. Edison looked at him. Then I'll get more men to keep an eye on Ian. Knowles nodded and left immediately. At a private villa in the suburbs, in the study room, Ken grabbed the collar of his subordinate and gnashed his teeth. Tell me now, how did it fail? The subordinate explained tremblingly, We're not sure either. We were all fully prepared, and he was on the brink of dying already at the time, but someone else discovered us. Ken thrust him away and slammed his fist on the desk, causing the whole desk to wobble. Ian, who was watching from the side, took a glimpse at the subordinate and walked up to Ken. Perhaps we've been set up. Ken calmed down, gnashed his teeth, and smirked. That boy, Knowles, I've underestimated him. He's indeed the future patriarch of the Knowles. Ian lowered his gaze. The young master of the Knowles escaped the pursuit and assassination that Madame Knowles cooked up for him when he was only a few years old. Since he has survived to this day, it means he's not someone to be trifled with. Ken narrowed his eyes. But who would know exactly when I planned to put an end to Ian's life? Ken's words made Ian tense subconsciously, but his expression was unchanged. Do you mean that someone leaked the plan? Chapter 1698. Ken glared toward his men. Everyone panicked in an instant. Sir, we really have no idea about this. We'll never betray you. Ian, what did Maggie do before the surgery? Ken's eyes were fixed on Ian's face. He was clearly doubting Maggie. Beads of cold sweat rolled down Ian's back as he lowered his head and replied, she didn't contact anyone 3 days before the surgery. She only asked me about Mr. Matthews, and it seemed that she was preparing herself. Ken did not utter a single word. Although he had doubts about Maggie, she had never had any interaction with the Knowles. He then scoffed. Doesn't she blame me for sending her over to Donald? The question implied that Maggie might betray him because she did not like this arrangement. Ian explained calmly, but Ian is a nobody to her. So even if she has a grudge against you, she doesn't need to do anything with Ian's matter. Feeling that what he said made some sense, Ken stopped talking, turned around, and ordered, go and look into all the men who are working for me. Ian nodded and left with the other subordinates. The next day, at the college, Daisy was resting in between rehearsals. She went to the restroom and heard the conversation between two girls as soon as she arrived at the door. Isn't Ian the son of a wealthy family? Is that a fake identity? I just met his father at the college. He looks nowhere near a filthy rich man, okay? Ian's real name is Fritz, and Ian Harris is only his stage name. His father still doesn't know about the fact that he's been suspended from school. He's been waiting at the academician's office for a long time. It's really pitiful to watch. Daisy, who was hiding behind the wall, was rendered speechless as a series of thoughts went through her mind. At the academician's office, a middle-aged man who was wearing simple but neat clothes was standing downstairs. The two security guards tried to persuade him to leave, but he refused to do so. Daisy looked around and walked toward the middle-aged man. Hello. The middle-aged man turned to look at her and nodded. And you are? Are you Ian's father? He's not here in college. The middle-aged man's expression looked distressed. After a long while, he asked, did he really own illegal drugs? Daisy did not dare to look straight at him. Ian may have been deceived too. He's been temporarily suspended while the college investigates the matter and hasn't been delisted from school, right? A glimmer of hope seemed to have appeared on the middle-aged man's anguished face. Yes, my son hasn't been delisted by the college. He's not that kind of person. That child must have been framed. Daisy pursed her lips and was about to say something, but she saw the man's devastated and scarred hands. Those hands were full of calluses, cracks, and scars. The severity of their condition was something that she had never seen before. And an indescribable feeling surged deep within Daisy. The pair of hands were protecting a package in his arms, and it seemed that the contents of the package were very important to him. She returned to her senses and asked carefully, Sir, are you here to deliver something to Ian? Yes, I brought his favorite cranberries for him, but I couldn't reach him. The hands holding on to the package tightened, and he looked worried. Daisy said with a smile, "Sir, if you trust me, you can hand it to me. I'll deliver it to Ian and convey your message when he returns to the college in a few days." "Yeah, of course. Thank you very much." He handed the package to Daisy and left. Daisy walked toward the dormitory building with the heavy package in her arms. Downstairs, she just happened to run into Nolace, who was getting out of the car. Thus, she smiled and trotted forward. "Nolace." Nolace smiled. "Has the rehearsal ended?" Chapter 1699. Daisy squinted and grinned. "It ended long ago." "What are you holding in your arms?" "This." Daisy did not know how to explain it. Thus, she lowered her head and pursed her lips. "If I were to tell you the truth, would you be angry?" Nolace stared at her face and squinted. "Won't you be afraid that I'll be angry if you keep it from me? This is something that Ian's father brought him. His father hasn't been able to contact him, Soy." Before she could finish speaking, Nolace took a deep breath. "It's Ian again. Do you plan to forgive him?" "It's not a matter of forgiving him or not. His father looks very pitiful, so I'm only delivering this to Ian on his behalf. What he did has nothing to do with his father." Nolace scoffed out of anger. "Then, do you know his whereabouts?" Daisy was startled. "I don't know, so I'm going to ask Colton to help me." "He doesn't know either." Nolace was unusually calm. "I'm the only person who knows where he is now." Daisy looked at him and handed him the package after a while. "Then you should hand this to him." Nolace took a glance at the package indifferently and looked expressionless. "Aren't you afraid that I'll throw it away?" Daisy lowered her gaze and retracted her hand. "I knew you'd be angry. I'll deliver it myself." Nolace pulled her into his arms and looked down at her. "How can I not be pissed? You think Ian's father is pitiful. That's why you want to intervene in his affairs. So if you learn what happened to him, you'll definitely pity him too, won't you?" Daisy was flustered. What does how pitiful his father looks has to do with how pitiful he is now? Nolace hugged her and kissed her on the forehead. "What I asked is that if you were to learn that he's currently having a bad time, would you sympathize with him?" She raised her head. "Sympathizing with him and forgiving him are two different things. Even if he's pitiful, it doesn't mean that I have to forgive him." Nolace chuckled softly. Daisy stepped in front of him and tiptoed, and her watery eyes were sparkling right in front of his face. "Then are you still angry?" He raised his eyebrows. "What if I'm still angry?" Without giving off any sign, she kissed him on the lips. The residual warmth left Nolace in a slight trance. Daisy did not dodge him this time around as she stared straight at him. "Then, want about this?" She instantly amused Nolace. It felt like a chicken's peck when it's eating rice off the ground. She chuckled and said, "What are you talking about? Are you comparing yourself to a grain of rice?" Nolace pinched her chin and sealed her lips with his. After that, he claimed with his hoarse voice as his fingers ran over her lips, "This is what you call a kiss." Her ears blushed, and she lowered her head. "Okay." Nolace took the package in her hands. "I'll send this to him." "You?" Daisy was slightly surprised. He was obviously not happy about it a minute ago. Nolace placed the package in the car, turned around, gently tapped the tip of her nose, and approached her. "You owe me one. You'll have to pay it back in the future." The car was parked at the gate of the hospital. Nolace did not get out of the car but asked Edison to bring the package to Ian in the ward. Edison took the package from him and stepped into the hospital without asking any further questions. After a while, Edison came out of the hospital and got back into the car. "I've delivered the package to him. How is he doing?" Edison replied, "Knowing that he's going to get amputated and be handicapped for the rest of his life, how great can he be?" Nolace did not utter a single word. Edison asked at that moment, Aren't you going to tell Miss Vanderbilt about this? Knowles lowered his gaze. It's best to keep her in the dark. Edison understood something and smiled. Miss Vanderbilt is too kind. She might not be able to accept such a cruel fact. Chapter 1700. Daisy had grown up in a very protective household, just like a delicate flower that was raised in a greenhouse and had never experienced a single storm in its life. So, how could she have seen such cruelties? That was especially so when he was related to why Ian got tortured in the first place. Another reason Knowles did not dare to tell Daisy about Ian was that he was worried she would learn about his involvement. That was why he had only left his good side to Daisy. At the same time, on the other side of the city, in the Pruitt Manor, the sound of a slap resounded in the living room. Freya's face was turned to the side, and her cheek flushed. She did not scream out of pain but listened to Sandy's reprimand. Just whose side are you on? Your brother's plan almost succeeded, and you've ruined it. As long as Daisy and Knowles could no longer get along because of this incident, Ken would have the opportunity to use this incident to get a hold of the daughter of the Goldman. However, she did not expect this ungrateful daughter of hers would betray her own family. Freya stared at her furious mother and asked calmly, "Mother, I don't hope to see you two walks down a path of no return. Do you really think the Goldman are a family you can deal with?" Sandy sneered. "It's not up to you to decide whether I can handle them or not. I only want the daughter of the Goldman to break up with that bastard, Knowles." Didn't Knowles take a fancy to Daisy only because of the Goldman's status and power that she had behind her? If she doesn't have the Goldman to back her up, how would he possibly even take a closer look at her? What Sandy said did not surprise Freya at all, as she had gotten used to it long ago. "Ken did inherit all his conceit from you. How dare you talk back to me?" Sandy slapped her again. Freya's ears buzzed this time around, and the hand hanging by her side clenched tightly. It seemed like that was not sufficient for Sandy to vent her exasperation, however. Thus, she yelled at the servants, "Bring me the whip." The servants looked at each other in dismay but did not dare to say a word, so they did as ordered. Sandy grabbed the whip and pointed it at her. "You, kneel before me." Freya knelt on the ground. Sandy swung the leather whip at her body, and the excruciating pain made Freya's body tense up. Every inch of her flesh that ended up covered in whip marks hid well under her clothes as they trembled from the agony. Freya did not let off any sound, not even a whimper, and gnashed her teeth. Beads of cold sweat rolled down from the edge of her jaw, and blood was drained away from her lips. The pain gradually turned into numbness, and the thin sleeves were eventually dyed red. The series of whipping did not stop until the whip snapped. Freya could feel the pain of her skin splitting and the quiver that took place within the muscle tissues that were now exposed to the air. Sandy threw the broken leather whip away and pointed to the door. "Useless piece of shit, lock her in the warehouse. And before she asks for mercy, no one is to give her a single drop of water without my permission." Freya's cell phone was confiscated, and she was locked away. There was no window in the warehouse, only ventilation pipes. As such, it was extremely warm, especially now that it was summer. Freya sat down slowly along the corner of the wall and gasped in pain when she seemed to have torn her wounds. She could not lie down completely, so she could only lean on her side. The warehouse door was closed, and the space around her turned into darkness in an instant. 2 days later, near the end of the month, the college's anniversary started. The tea stage for the show had been built and decorated, and the lighting and backdrop gave the hall a grandeur comparable to the Sheena Fashion Week, which looked solemn and splendid. Daisy tried on her costume backstage and repeatedly sent Freya text messages via her cell phone, but Freya had not responded since the last text, which had been sent 2 days ago. She could not help but worry. Suddenly, she received a text message from Freya on her cell phone. "Pruitt Manor, the young lady has been locked up by Mrs. Pruitt." Daisy got up immediately, dashed out to the corridor, and called Colton. "Colton, something happened to Freya." "At the Pruitt Manor." Sandy sat in the living room. arranging flowers and ignoring the fact that Freya was still locked in the warehouse. Brandon came home from a business trip at this time and learned about the things that had transpired 2 days ago, so he entered the living room and asked, "You've locked Faye in the warehouse for 2 days.